So the activity I chose was focusing on roommates and using the imperative form, making suggestions, and softening language. So when creating this lesson, I figured the students would have knowledge of the needed vocabulary, the imperative form, and the basic form of making suggestions using should. So the materials needed for this lesson are just handouts, a recording from this website, ESL Lounge, and a whiteboard and marker. So an overview of the lesson would be that the lesson provides students with the context of roommates to use language softening techniques to make suggestions. Students will learn ways to soften language when making suggestions to others, and students will also use the imperative form to make a list of rules. And then the objectives would be that students would learn tips to soften language, then use those techniques in the appropriate context, and then they will use the imperative form to make suggestions and rules. So this context would be considered communicative because it is introducing the topic of roommates, which is a real-world situation, and it's allowing students to use the type of language they may actually use with their roommates when making suggestions or talking about rules in the household. Okay, so first I would begin class with this introduction activity. It would take about 5 minutes depending on how good the discussion grows, so it could take about 5 to 10 minutes. And it would just be a group discussion about living situations. So as an instructor, the instructor would just ask questions like, where do you live? Do you live in a house or an apartment? Do you live alone or with others? Are you happy with where you live and why? So this activity is just focusing on speaking and listening, and it also introduces students to the topic. And it also gives students a chance to use previously targeted vocabulary words when answering these questions. And so the next activity would be a listening centered activity. So it's about roommates and softening language, and it should take about 30 minutes. So this activity would also be integrated with a speaking and reading component. So students will listen to a recording of a situation between roommates, and then after the first listen, the instructor will ask the students questions, replaying the recording as needed. Then, as a final comprehension check, students will complete a worksheet with true and false questions. Next, students will be asked to notice the tone and word choice of Jim in the recording. Students will notice that Jim is being negative and sounds kind of mad or maybe mean. And then the instructor will solicit suggestions on how Jim can sound nicer. So after those suggestions, the instructor will introduce the subject of language softening and introduce the phrases, I was hoping you could, and I was wondering if you could, and also using please and thank you when communicating. So this introduces students to a common situation amongst roommates, and the students are taught ways to handle the situation, which adds to the communicativity of the activity. Okay, so the next activity would be a role play activity that would take about 25 minutes, and it would just be a roommate role play. So students will be in pairs for this activity, and they will be given a list of roommate complaints. So students must then take turns making suggestions in a polite manner based on the complaints. So I created a list of complaints of common mishaps that happen between roommates. So like the music is too loud at night, or dishes are never clean, the lights are always left on, TV is always left on, your pet dog barks all the time. So what the students would have to do is take turns transforming these statements into suggestions that they could suggest for the other student to do. So if the music is too loud at night, the student can say, I was hoping you could turn your music down at night, or I was hoping you could turn your music down after 9 p.m. Something of that nature, using those language softening techniques to come across as a polite person. And so this activity just allows students to use those techniques in a suitable context and get more practice with speaking and reading. And so for the final activity, students will practice their writing skills to turn their complaints into a list of house rules. So students will use the imperative form to create the rules and then follow an example that is given by the instructor. So an example would be, do not listen to loud music past 9 p.m. Okay, so this activity just supplements the speaking and listening centered activities previously explored and gives students more practice with that imperative form and making suggestions in other ways, not just using the softening techniques or the should form. Okay.